Recently I posted a haul video that included quite a few new pens that I'd picked up. A lot of you also gave me great recommendations in the comments on that video, so now I have even more new pens and inks to test. So today we're going to be thoroughly trying out these new drawing utensils. The pens and inks that I'm going to be testing out are the Fine Point Bic Round Stick Ball Pen in black, the Bic Orange Crystal Fine Pen also in black, the Lamy Safari Fountain Pen with the black Lamy T10 ink cartridge, another fine tip fountain pen, but in this case I'm more interested in testing out the ink inside, which is the Platinum Carbon ink, and lastly is the Pentel Brush Pen also in black. Let's start it with some general tests of the various inks. Now all of these pens are very different from each other. We've got a couple of ballpoint pens, a couple of fountain pens, a brush pen, so I wanted to do different kinds of swatches to show the variations between those, between the possible variations in line thickness as well as how much variation you can get with difference in pressure. So starting out with the Fine Point Bic Round Stick Pen, this is a ballpoint pen, and like most ballpoint pens, you can vary the ink opacity a lot just by changing the pressure you use. This Fine Bic Round Stick Pen and this Bic Orange Cristal Pen are supposed to be, in theory, very similar. This Crystal Fine Pen is supposed to have a 0.8mm ball, and the previous Bic pen is supposed to have a 0.7mm ball. And just from doing these tests, I really can't see much of a line thickness difference. I mean, there is a little bit, but 0.1 millimeters really is not a very large difference. And in terms of how they feel and how the ink looks, they do look basically the same. For the first of the fountain pens, we have the Lamy Safari with the Lamy ink cartridge in this particular pen. In terms of ink flow and variance that you can get, it is a fountain pen, so you can get a little bit, but overall the ink is flowing pretty smoothly, so you are getting more of a consistent line and ink flow. Now this particular Safari pen is one with a fine point nib. I don't believe that there is a particular millimeter size equivalent to that, so as far as sizing goes, it's just a fine point nib, and the ink is definitely really nice and black. Definitely more black than the ballpoint pens, but again, that's sort of to be expected given that they are completely different types of pens. Now for the carbon ink. Now this I just put into a random fountain pen that I had lying around that was empty. This I also believe is a fine point nib. It does definitely seem like it's about the same size as the Lamy Safari pen, but as far as the ink goes, it definitely had a bit of a different texture to the Lamy ink cartridges. I almost want to say it flowed more or it was wetter. I'm not entirely sure how much of that might have been this particular pen or if it's just one of the properties of the ink itself. But anyways, this ink flows beautifully and is really nice and black. And finally, the Pentel Brush Pen. Now this pen obviously is quite different from the others as it is the only brush pen that I am testing out today, and I got really excited when I saw and heard about this particular pen because I was hoping, and it definitely pans out, that it's almost like a super fine version of the very much loved Pentel Brush Pen. I do want to warn you right now though, right off the bat, is that it's not the same ink as the Pentel Brush Pen, but if you love how that pen works with the synthetic hairs, then you will probably love this pen as well. Here's an overview of those initial test swatches. Something particular that I wanted to test out just because I'd had problems with especially fountain pens in the past was how fast the ink actually sets. So these are some real-time tests of first the Lamy Safari pen just to see exactly how fast that ink can set and not become a smudgy mess if you happen to run your hand across it while drawing. And to keep the tests in the same family, this is the carbon ink swatch, which, as you can see, definitely sets a lot slower than the Lamy ink cartridges, which does make sense. Just from my initial testing, it did seem like the ink was a lot wetter, or at least came out of the fountain pen a lot quicker and created possibly more of a wet wet spot on the page, and it does end up panning out in these smudge tests. And it's not like ink taking longer to set is like a deal breaker or anything. It's just important to know exactly how your particular pens perform, and maybe consider that when looking at what type of drawing you're using it for. So maybe faster drawing inks you want to use more for sketching, because there's a greater chance of you sort of running your hand across it like a lunatic if you're scribbling really fast. And just as a comparison, I also did smudge tests of the ballpoint pens, which, as you can see, the ink pretty much sets instantaneously, which again does make sense given that ballpoint pens tend to have pretty dry ink, and that is also why they tend to not be the blackest on the page. I also did these slightly random swatch tests of the two ballpoint pens just because I wasn't 100% sure from my initial testing if one of the inks happened to be just a little bit darker than the other, but they do appear to be the exact same given those swatch tests. And as for the smudge test on the brush pen, it seemed to set decently fast. It definitely wasn't as instantaneous as the ballpoint pens, but it did not take as long to set as the carbon ink. Now, there is the possibility that this could change slightly depending on the type of paper that you're using for your illustration using these pens, but I was using some watercolor paper scraps because the next thing that I want to test out is the water resistance of each of these inks. Now, I did leave these swatches for a couple of hours just in case there was any prolonged dry time. Again, it's something that might end up changing if you let it sit for longer, but just as a heads up, these were after a couple of hours on the page. So the first Bic pen, pretty water resistant. Most cheaper ballpoint pens are to a fairly good degree. You can sort of have a little bit of ghosting of some grayishness in the water from time to time, but overall they hold up well enough that I doubt you would really see that in any pieces if you were to use some watercolor on them. The Lamy ink was a completely different story, as you can see. And again, this isn't really like a deal breaker or anything, it's just, keep in mind the properties of that particular pen and what situations to maybe use it or not use it for. Now, the carbon ink, from everything that I can ascertain, is supposed to be waterproof, and it does definitely hold up as fairly water resistant, but as you can see in the water surrounding the areas that I sort of ran my brush over, there is a little bit of gray ghosting, and again, I'm not entirely sure if this would change if it sat for a little longer and maybe more completely dried, but it is just something to keep in mind. And the Pentel sign pen was definitely not water resistant at all, which is also why I mentioned earlier that this is definitely not the same ink as the PenTell Brush Pen, because I'm pretty sure that although the PenTell Brush Pen is not like 1,000,000% waterproof, it definitely does not smear this easily or badly. And now to actually test these pens out doing some artwork. First up are the ballpoint pens. Now, normally I would like using these for more realistic shadings on portraits or something like that, but I decided to go a little wild this time and do a landscape instead. Overall, I really like these pens. I know I mentioned in my haul that I wasn't entirely sure if I would end up preferring one over the other, but I did end up using both kinds in this one illustration just to see if I could tell any differences between them, whether, they were the particular areas that I drew using each pen or just the feel of it overall, just any sort of looks if I could distinguish between the two, and I really can't. I know the ball size is supposed to be different on them, but again, it's so minute that I really cannot tell a particular difference when using them. I think the biggest difference, if you could even call it that almost, that somebody might prefer one over the other is if you had any preference with the grip or feel of the actual barrel or pen itself. The fine point Bic one, the black one, not the one that I'm using right now, it has a completely just smooth cylinder outer casing, and the Cristal orange fine one that I'm using here has more of that hexagonal pencil-like design. I do think these pens will become my go-to ballpoint pen. I really like having the finer tip on them. It just helps you with the control and getting more fine details in, obviously, and I really can't see why I would go back to using ones with a thicker tip. I mean, at some point I might need to, just if I'm working on a larger piece and I find that these might be a little too fine, but for the usual sketchbook doodles that I would use these for, I will definitely be grabbing one of these pens. Next up is the Lamy Pen. Now, there is really nothing in particular that I wanted to try drawing with this pen. I kind of bought this particular fountain pen sort of as an everyday sketchbook kind of pen that I could use for just whatever, pretty much, that I might have wanted to use a fountain pen instead of a different type of pen. And so the day that I filmed this, I ended up seeing this picture of this really crazy and cool looking Norwegian church. And so I decided to draw it using the Lamy pen and just doing not really cross-hatching, but just really doodly lines and just really seeing how the pen would work and how much detail I could get into this little drawing. Out of all the pens in this video, this was the one that I had already used a little bit, like nothing excessively, but I had done some sketch studies that week using this a little more than the other pens, so I already had a pretty good feel for how it reacted, and I do really like this pen. I know for some people the ink in the pen would be a bit of a deal breaker because it isn't waterproof, but because it dries so fast, and I really ended up seeing this pen as more of maybe an opaque ballpoint pen sort of idea. Like, the ink in this is very ballpoint pen like that, you know, it dries pretty fast, but because it isn't as dry as ballpoint pen ink, it is a lot darker, and that look is obviously something that is very desirable for different types of drawings. And I've been trying to work on my different cross-hatching and ink work a lot, and this pen has been the go-to one for that. And even just outside of the ink itself, the pen I really like the feel of. I'll probably talk about it more when I'm using the other fountain pen, but this one is just, it's a great weight. It doesn't feel overly heavy like some other fountain pens can, and obviously if I want to use a more water resistant or proof ink in the pen, I can always get an ink converter or get another one of these kinds of pens and use a different ink in it. But I do actually really like the Lamy ink cartridges, and I think they work great for the purpose that I was hoping for, which is more of just black and white sketching in my sketchbook, just any sort of illustrations that I want to be inked, but I have no worry about watercoloring them or using any sort of wet media on them later. Next up is the fountain pen with the carbon ink in it. I know I haven't talked a lot about this particular fountain pen. I'm not actually sure if it is a particular brand or not. It was just an empty fountain pen that I had laying around my studio that had an ink converter in it, so it worked out great for trying out this ink, but any information for any of the products that I've been using in this video will be in the description box. This, I know, again, another building. Who am I? What has happened to usual me who only does portraits all of the time? But again, I really just didn't know what I wanted to try out using this ink for. I wanted to do something that would really showcase the ink and be more line work heavy with just general cross-hatching and just not adding anything else other than the ink to the illustration, and really just seeing what I could do with the ink and pens on their own. Now, the thing that I noticed when I was working on this illustration was something that sort of came up when I was doing the tests, and because the ink flow either on this pen or it's the ink itself is so much more wet than some of the other inks, I found that it was bleeding a bit on this paper. For this, I'm using my Luctrum 19 whatever it is sketchbook that I also showed off in that haul video. And so it's more of a mixed media type of paper. It's not thin by any means, and this was the only pen and ink combination that had that bit of bleeding. It wasn't anything terrible, it was just on the ends of the lines that I was doing where I might have paused just a little bit. All of a sudden there's this slight expansion blob of ink there, and I was actually a little concerned that it might actually be bleeding through the paper, but it doesn't appear to have gone at least all of the way through. There might be a little bit of ghosting on the other side, but it didn't actually go through, which is fine. And again, not entirely sure if it is the ink itself or the pen, but I do really like this ink. It is super opaque, and I also like that it is water resistant to a fairly good degree once it has dried. And because it is an ink that you can fill any fountain pen with, that is a great benefit, because I don't actually really love this particular fountain pen that I decided to put it in. It's a nice pen, it writes really nicely, but I find for me it's a bit heavy. I don't know if that's because I have like small flimsy hands or whatever, but just the weight of it does feel really nice that it is so weighted, but I found that the weight of the pen I feel like was possibly messing up my lines a bit, and just things did not necessarily go as smoothly as I would have hoped. And lastly is the Pentel Brush Sign Pen, which I did end up reverting back to my old portrait ways just because I apparently was in the mood to torture myself with drawing extensive amounts of detail in curly hair. But seriously, I did specifically choose something that I could put a lot of detail into so I could really test out this pen, because this was possibly the pen that I was the most excited about trying out. The Pentel Brush Pen is one of my all-time favorite pens, so when I saw this one I got really excited, and I can definitely say that these brush sign pens are of equal quality. I really love them. I know I didn't get a chance to mention before, but they do actually come in a bunch of colors. I ended up having to buy a 12 box of them, and so I just went with somewhat boring old black, but if you were into sketching in a particular color, or maybe could find somewhere that sold them individually if you didn't want so many in one go, then they do actually come in a bunch of really cool colors, which is awesome, seeing as the Pentel Brush Pen itself is just a black only ink situation that does have the refillable cartridges, which I guess is the one downside to this particular pen, it being, I would say, comparable to basically a small, thin version of the Pentel Brush Pen, is that it doesn't have any refillable cartridge capabilities, so not as like economically friendly as the usual Pentel Brush Pen. But if you are looking for something that is finer but still has the feel of the Pentel Brush Pen, then this one is definitely it. I'm not entirely sure if the fibers of the brush themselves are the exact same. It definitely feels like it. It's performs, from what I can recall. It's been a little bit since I used my usual Pentel Brush Pen, but it does really just feel like a thin version of that pen, which is awesome because, you know, sometimes you are working on smaller pieces, and I would say that the PenTell Brush Pen, I would consider that more of a medium to large brush nib. It's probably around a size 4 or 5 maybe in like round brush sizes, and this one is more of like a 2 to 3, I would say, if you look at like a traditional round brush size situation. So you're looking at like half of the brush size. So you might be someone that really loves the look of the PenTell brush pen, but for the pieces that you're working on, you find that even though it has amazing control, seeing as it is a brush pen, maybe it's just a little too big for what you are generally drawing up. And so this is where that pen could come in really handy for some people. I also think that just using it in conjunction with the PenTell brush pen would go really well. I did end up later on actually coloring in that like shoulder black area. I wanted it to be completely black, and it was like taking forever using this tiny brush, so I grabbed my Pentel brush pen and colored that in just to also see if there was any sort of, like, I knew that the ink was different, but I wasn't entirely sure how noticeable color wise, or just, you know, if you use different pens beside each other, you can generally see a bit of difference, but there wasn't actually that much difference in the black color between the pens, which was really cool. So I don't think that if you ended up using both pens in the same illustration, you would, it would be super noticeable or anything. I know that the extreme lack of waterproofness of this pen would be a deal breaker for a lot of people. I know a lot of people end up using the Pentel brush pen on top of watercolors, which obviously that wouldn't be a problem with this pen either. If you're not actually adding any water on top of it, you could still reap the nice stylistic benefits of the pen itself without having to worry about waterproofness later. But overall, I really love this pen, and I love that it's smaller so I can get a lot of more fine detail into drawings easier. It might actually end up being possibly slightly more used than my usual Pentel brush pen because of that. And those are all of my thoughts about my new pens. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one.